Hi, everybody. Welcome back to History and Politics Chat on December 29th, 2020. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I am a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. Let me hold up white for my friend. And you have a bunch of questions today, and there are a lot of questions today. And I'm going to try and throw them into some sort of order, but I'm not going to get to everything. And I'm going to try and riff in ways that you may or may not find useful. So here we go. Lots of questions starting out today with what's going on with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and the stimulus money that he has just stopped going through the Senate. What is going on with that? Well, let me explain first of all why there was this sudden push for a stimulus check that would go to individuals for $2,000 instead of $600, which is what the Consolidated Appropriations Act of last week actually did. Let me remind you of that because people are really confused about this. Because there's a whole bunch of different laws that are in the mix, and they've pulled them together in funny ways. And by the way, somebody said to me that they thought that I was advocating that Congress do this, that they pass everything at the end of a session all at once. And I actually don't think it's a good idea. I think we actually should have bills that are discussed and they're discrete, so you can have some sense of what's going on instead of getting a 5,500-page bill to look at. So the Coronavirus Relief Act, and that's not what it's called, but that's what it was. It was a bill for coronavirus relief and for money for hospitals and for the distribution of vaccines. And among other things, it provided a $600 check, got mushed together with an entirely different bill, And that one was the Appropriations Act. And the Appropriations Act for the fiscal year of 2021, so that stretches from October 1st through September 30th of every year, just because they know I can't do math, so they decide to put the fiscal year in such a way that it has nothing to do with either the academic year or the tax year. So I don't even try and figure out where these months are. I just remember what they are. All right, so theoretically, Congress should have come up with an Appropriations Act before this fiscal year. So they should have come up with one last summer, but they didn't. So what they've been doing is they have been pushing off that funding of the government since they should have come up with a bill by what are called continuing resolutions, basically saying, we're going to get to that. So until then, we're going to go ahead and fund the government. And that prevents a government shutdown. And those can be of any length of time. And it's just kind of a kicking the can down the road thing. And it enables them to have more time to come up with a budget. But they had to do it before this particular Congress folds its tent and goes home at the beginning of January. So they took the Coronavirus Relief Act and they took that appropriations bill and they smashed them together. Then they added a whole bunch of other things to it as well. And this is always done at the end of a congressional session where people kind of put their favorite stuff into a bill, including, for example, lots of extensions of tax cuts. So you will have seen that big bill threw out about $200 billion. It kept 200, extended the existence of about $200 billion in tax cuts. So you got the coronavirus, you got the appropriations, you got these tax cuts, and then you have things like the Congress went ahead and authorized groups to begin to construct a Latino mall, a Latino museum, and a women's history museum on the federal mall. And you're seeing a lot about people saying, I don't want my money going to that right now. Your money is not going to that right now. But in order for the Smithsonian to open new branches, Congress has to go ahead and approve for that to happen. Like, I can't decide that I'm going to put a monument to clocks in the middle of the mall until Congress tells me I can, and then I can start the process of doing it. But that's what was going on with that. So that's in there, and there's, all the kitchen sink stuff. They call it decorating the Christmas tree. Off the top of my head now, Mitch McConnell's got something in there about something to do with racehorses. I don't remember what. They just throw in a bunch of other stuff that is popular with a lot of people, and not unpopular enough that it needs to be argued about or might get rejected. So they throw all that together. So we have here the coronavirus Relief Act, the appropriations bill, the tax cuts, the other kitchen sink stuff, and they smashed it all together in this bill that was like 56, about 55. It's about 5,600 pages long. All right. So that's one bill, right? And then I've also talked a lot about the National Defense Authorization Act, which has another bill tucked in it, which is the Corporate Transparency Act. And I'm fascinated by that. But actually, you guys didn't ask about that. So you asked about McConnell and the stimulus money. Okay, so they passed this sucker. They've been arguing about these bills for months and months and months and months. And the House Democrats have been negotiating. Mitch McConnell really wasn't negotiating over a lot of that stuff. He pulled out of it. So what that meant was that the White House was negotiating with the Democrats, largely led by Steve Mnuchin, who is at the head of the Treasury Department. And so when they finally hammered this bill together, and if you remember, in terms of stimulus checks at all, Mitch McConnell was dead set against them. But he's in trouble right now. And this is really confusing. I know it's a lot of moving pieces, but right now, control of the Senate is going to come down to whatever happens to those Senate runoff elections in Georgia that are happening on January 5th. And the Republicans are really getting hammered because they didn't support a coronavirus relief bill. So McConnell's like, oh, crap, I'm going to lose my Senate Majority Leader seat. I got to go ahead and back this. So he does, and they put together this bill. Passes Congress. Everybody expects Donald Trump's going to sign it. And he doesn't. He doesn't say if he's going to veto it. He just says, I'm not going to do it. And I don't like it, among other reasons, because it only provides $600 in direct payments, and we should get people more money. We should give them $2,000. And which is where the Democrats had been until they got talked down by the White House. So everyone's like, what on earth is going on here in the middle of this? So the Trump caved sort of bizarrely on that, and finally just went and signed the bill. But then he said, "Oh, I'm going to want other stuff as well. Don't worry about that. That's going absolutely nowhere." But then once he went in and signed the bill and it became law, now he's got the problem of the fact that he, meaning Mitch McConnell, has the problem of the fact that Donald Trump has just said to everybody around the country, and by the way, as I know many of you are aware, but if you are not aware, the country is really hurting right now. I mean, hurting really badly. So the fact that they would say, oh yeah, the president wants $2,000 relief payments, but we're not going to give them to you, even though that's what the Democrats want too. That didn't sit very well. So the Democrats jump up and they say, hey, we're more than happy to give $2,000 relief payments. That sounds fabulous to us. That's what we wanted all along. And the Republicans then are like, oh crap, we don't want those. We don't want to be spending money by making these direct payments to people. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about that in a second. So now they're in a real mess because the Republican president has come out in favor of them, and the Democrats are like laughing in their sleeves going, we told you guys, now you're in real trouble in this, in the country in general, but certainly in Georgia. So they went ahead, the Democrats went ahead and they put forward a new clean bill that just had this increase in payments in it. In the House, I've lost track of time. I think it was yesterday. I don't remember. Yeah, it was yesterday. And enough Republicans signed on. I mean, it was kind of a freebie for the Republicans because they knew it was going to pass anyway. So about 100 Republicans signed on board and said, yeah, we're gonna do what Donald Trump wanted. We're going to sign up on this. So then today it went in front of the Senate. And that's what you asked me about. What on earth is Mitch McConnell's game? Well, Mitch McConnell, Charles Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader from New York, tried to get that payment through a Senate rule for unanimous consent. And Mitch McConnell stood up and said, no, I don't want any part of this. And so he made it so it couldn't go through by unanimous consent. It could go through in some other fashion, but basically McConnell was saying, we're not playing this game. So what is he up to? Why is he against that? And I find this question fascinating because a number of you asked what the game was with this. It's really important, I think, to remember that although Mitch McConnell is the senator for Kentucky, which is a small rural state, he really represents the sort of international high rollers, if you will. He is the senator who's interested in protecting the interests of a very small group of Americans at the very top of society. And they are ideologically committed to the idea that the federal government should not be putting its money into people at the bottom of society, that is, in their minds, going to destroy America. Because what that does is it means that people at the top really don't have control over their entire fortunes. That is, they have to they have to have regulations and they have to pay taxes. And that to them, there's actually an ideological argument against it. And the ideological argument against that is that it impinges on their liberty. They can't do whatever they want if the government steps in and says, oh, wait a minute here, you need to pay taxes because your workers are starving. Their take on that is that it's a shame, probably, that those workers are starving. But if they were really good at what they did, they would succeed the same way the leaders of society do. Now, I don't adhere to that. I am trying to tell you what the ideology behind it is, and I can certainly tell you the history of that ideology and how it got to where it is in America and all those things. I've written books on it. But what Mitch McConnell is really doing is serving that group of people with the belief that that's how you move society forward. You make sure that people who have made it and who have a lot of money have control over how they run their businesses and what they do with their money. And if you're going to do that, then no, you absolutely don't want to commit the federal government to things like direct payments to people. They would say that that is socialism, that socialism has come to America. And I've explained how that's a weird American version of socialism. It's just a word that means something very different in world stage, but we have used that word in America for something very different. So McConnell has made the gamble that he would rather stop the idea of these extra payments and take the risk of not being reelected majority, or of not continuing to have control over Congress. It seems pretty likely he thinks he is going to win at least one of those seats in Georgia to continue to be majority leader, rather than actually saying, okay, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and support this payment. Now, that being said, McConnell is also pretty openly at war with Donald Trump, or rather Donald Trump is pretty openly at war with Mitch McConnell, because Donald Trump is furious that McConnell has acknowledged that Joe Biden won the election, even though, again, I keep saying Joe Biden did not win that election by a little amount. I mean, this was a very clean win. It was a huge win. It was the biggest win for somebody who was who was challenging an incumbent since 1932, because incumbency has an awful lot of benefits to it. And he's won handily in the Electoral College as well. So McConnell really didn't have much choice at that point when he finally went ahead and acknowledged Biden, much so late that it was really an insult. Trump is furious that he did that. And he's also furious with what's the person known as the majority whip. It's the person who makes sure that everybody in the Senate does what the party leader wants. That's a guy named John Thune of South Dakota. And he also came out and said not only that Biden won, but that Trump ought to cut it out, that this was ridiculous and going forward. So one of the reasons that Trump pulled what he did on by saying he might sign it, he might not, was twofold. One, it continues to keep the spotlight on him, and you can see him chafing as people start to lose interest in what he's doing, because he's not, he's a lame duck. And also because it's kind of it fits his personality to try and ruin everybody's holiday, which, kind of happened. So that's what was going on with that, and why Mitch McConnell has said no to that. I'm not at all surprised that he said no, but it is, I want to end up with why all of these things matter. There's a much larger story here than just the story of that particular check, although it's a big deal. That's a big deal that he did that. All right, so people have asked me some other questions about that giant package. And one of the things I wanted to say about the 5,500-page bill is that, again, somebody said, oh, you wrote about it and you sound like you think it's a good idea. And the answer is I really don't. I think that one of the reasons people have a hard time figuring out what our government is doing is because they pull crap like this. And somebody wrote to me the night it was passed, said, you need to read that bill, and this is what's in it. And the person wrote down all the things they told me were in it. Well, I happen to know that bill hadn't been printed yet. So whoever was telling me what was in it certainly had not read it. And it was pretty clear that the person was simply parroting what had been heard on right-wing media, because I do read bills, but it's going to be a cold day, you know where, before I sit down and read a 5,500-page bill over vacation. And that's not okay. We should have bills that it's okay, maybe not, you on your way to your job read the bills, but it is my job to read the bills. A 5,500-page bill is, when you read tax bills, for example, they're hundreds of pages long, but hundreds of pages is pretty much okay. 5,500, not so much. And that, I think, really manages to pull away from a lot of us a knowledge of what's going on. I was totally shocked the other day, completely shocked, when I recognized that I got so obsessed that night. And the reason I went to bed so late that night was because I had no idea that Corporate Transparency Act was in the National Defense Authorization Act. I just didn't know it was there. And I don't think a lot of reporters knew it was there either. And that was something that had been debated at great length, that had been passed by bipartisan majorities at the beginning of December. And then it got folded into the National Defense Authorization Act, I think because they recognized that Trump would have a hard time vetoing that. He vetoed it anyway. And now it's the House passed it over his veto today, and at the Senate, it's going to the Senate. And I'm going to be fascinated to see if the Senate passes it. But that CTA, Corporate Transparency Act, ends American shell companies for the most part. There's some loopholes in it, but that means you can no longer create that fake company, for example, that paid off Stormy Daniels. You have to, if you're going to create a company, you have to tell the federal government who owns it, which is a no-brainer. Every other country does it. But we apparently are second only to the Cayman Islands in terms of being secretive. Again, somebody suggested that I had made that statistic up. I promise you, I know absolutely nothing about where to develop illegal or secret companies. I read that, and if you have questions about it, they're in my notes when I wrote about it that night. All right, so I'm seeing another one here. And I will try and get to why Trump is appointing people to defense boards. I've actually written about that at some length. So if you are curious, go ahead and Google it. What you can do is go to the Facebook, Heather Cox Richardson Facebook page, and then there's a search bar, and just use some terms that look familiar. And it's actually really, really good. I use it a lot, actually, to look stuff up. Okay, so now Tim Mauk has asked, what are my thoughts on how much money the U.S. gives to other countries, given our own troubles here at home with so many unemployed, small business owners barely hanging on, and so on? And my answer to that is this. We have a real problem here in America, because what we have done since 1981 is we've gone ahead and we have starved our government. And we are now in this incredible position of having an extraordinary debt, but also an extraordinary deficit. That is, we pay out a ton of money every year, even though we're not bringing it in any kind of revenue. And the idea, of course, behind that was, under Reagan and the theories of supply side economics, that if you cut taxes for people at the very top, like I began talking about Mitch McConnell and his people, they would have, people at the top, industrialists and so on, would have lots of money, and they would go ahead and they would make more jobs. And that would mean that everybody would be employed and there would be more revenue coming in because everybody would have a job. And guess what? It doesn't work. We've been doing it since 1981. It doesn't work. In fact, even at the time, if you remember, George H.W. Bush called it voodoo economics, I think for very good reasons. It's just not going to work. And then when David Stockman went in as Reagan's budget director and put in all the tax cuts, and the machines at the Office of Management and Budget kicked back, boy, you're going to be in real trouble here with the debt if you do this. He just reprogrammed the machines. He reprogrammed the computers. So we have overall a problem. We are spending more money than we are taking in. The answer to that, in my mind, and I'll explain why in a minute, is not necessarily to keep cutting. You know, in the modern world, maybe I need to give this a little more background, I will in a minute. There are things we need to spend money on, and I will explain where we got to the point where we spend money on foreign countries. But that being said, I think there's a lot of things to talk about there. So let me start here with, I said we're spending all this money, we don't have the revenue coming in. We have all-time low taxes in America right now. And the taxes are falling wildly disproportionately on the bottom 90%, if you will. The top 10% and the top 1% pay taxes, and you often see, oh, they pay more in taxes than everybody else. They pay a much lower percentage of what they have made and what they earn than the rest of us do. Now, that being said, I just want to remind you that in the 1950s, that so many people on the right talk about as being the halcyon days of America, in those days, the top tax bracket in America under Dwight Eisenhower was 91%. So, for example, in this last election, when Trump would say, oh, Joe Biden is going to raise taxes through the roof and you're all going to, it's going to turn to socialism and all that, all Biden has suggested is taking away Trump's tax cuts, getting us back to where we were 4 years ago, which again, with the Trump tax cuts, that upper tax bracket actually now pays less than the middle. The numbers crossed. They pay less than people in the middle now. So my take on it, on our problem, is we do have a problem. My answer is not to keep cutting. Now, that does not say necessarily that all of our foreign money is well spent. Those are different issues. One of the big things I was trying to do is keep my categories straight. We have a spending problem and we have an income problem. The way to fix that is not to continue, in my mind, to continue cutting, because we are cutting beyond the bone. We Americans like to think we live this great life because that's what our rhetoric tells us. Every other developed country in the world has healthcare, and they have education, and they have good roads. They have all kinds of things we don't have. Now, there's a number of reasons we don't have them, but one of the reasons is because since 1981, we've been wedded to tax cuts with the idea that if we just cut everything, we would get back to this wonderful era. Now, let me explain to you how we got to this idea that somehow we could get back to a past that is going to be wonderful so long as we simply cut everything. And the answer to that is the 1930s and the 1940s and the New Deal. Because what really dramatically changed in the 1930s, between 1933 and until 1981, was America developed a government that was known as a liberal government. And that word became an epithet, and it's changed through history. I've talked about that before. But it developed a government that was based in the idea that the government has a role to play in regulating business, providing a basic social safety net, and promoting infrastructure. And as a government that does that, does a number of things, among other things, in order to fund those things, it collects taxes. So from the time that New Deal went into place under Franklin Delano Roosevelt and was continued by Harry Truman. And then when the Republicans put their own stamp on it under Eisenhower, he called it the middle way, but it was the same idea. Since that time, there was a backlash of largely big businessmen and to some degree social conservatives beginning in the 1950s that said we need to get rid of a government that does that. We got to get rid of taxes. We got to get rid of regulation. That's what they really care about, is regulation. We got to turn infrastructure over to private interests. Because that's how the country will move forward best. We want to go back to the 1920s, because in the 1920s, in their minds, the country was doing great. You had all these innovations, everything looked wonderful, and mind you, that's the way it was in their minds. The glories of the 1920s were glories really only for people at the top, because while there was an extreme change in the amount of production that was going on in the country, the benefits of that production were all going up to the top. The average, the real wages for workers in America were staying the same, and lots of populations in the 1920s were actually doing quite poorly. African Americans did not do particularly well in the 20s. Latinos did not do very well in the 20s, and nor did any farmers or rural people. If there wasn't, as we've discovered since in the 21st century, if it didn't make sense to run electricity, if there wasn't money to run electricity into Appalachia, for example, the companies didn't do it. And that's why we get things like the Tennessee Valley Authority to spread electricity to parts of the country that business wouldn't do. So there's this backlash that says we've got to go back to that period when you need to drown government in a bathtub. I mean, you've heard that before. And the idea is to get rid of that New Deal government. Well, the trick is that a lot of us like that New Deal government. But anyway, I'm going to go back to that in a minute. But to get back to the question about giving money to other countries, where on earth did that come from? Okay, Eisenhower. That really comes from this whole idea that the government does have a role to play in regulating business, providing a basic social safety net, and promoting infrastructure. So Eisenhower gets into office. He's elected in 1952. He takes office in 53, and he ran for office in 52. He ran for the Republican nomination against a guy named Robert Taft, Senator Taft of Ohio. And Taft was dead against the idea of America being involved in other countries. He was an isolationist. He wanted to get rid of all this messing around in Europe. He did like the idea of protecting American interests in Asia, but he hated NATO. He hated all that. He said it was going to be a waste of money, and he didn't want Americans' tax dollars to go to things like that. So Eisenhower actually goes to him and he says, listen, if you will get behind the idea of NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was holding the line against the spread of Russian communism, if you will get behind that, I won't run for office. And Taft says, forget it. I don't, let the Europe go hang by itself. Like, I don't care what happens over there. I don't want to have any part of foreign aid. And when that happens, Eisenhower runs, and he runs for this reason, because he recognizes that a population that is unstable, economically, religiously, culturally, but certainly economically, is in real trouble, because a population that has been destabilized economically, the way Germany was after World War I, for example, is very easily manipulated by dictators, either religious dictators or authoritarian figures like Hitler and Mussolini. And Eisenhower recognized that if you let other countries destabilize themselves economically, what that was going to do is it was going to open the way for other dictators to rise. And here's why that was a kicker for him. Because after the war, World War II, America had developed nuclear weapons. And if, in fact, those nuclear weapons fell into the hands of dictators, Eisenhower firmly believed that the world would end. So he figures out that America has got to be continuing to aid countries around the world because he wants to try and stabilize their economies and make sure everybody has an increasing standard of living. And he's focused on the economy. He wants to make sure that people can eat, because if they can't eat, they're going to be destabilized, and they're going to go ahead and follow whatever person promises to feed their kids or to make sure that they are culturally or religiously relevant again. So he starts to try and push back on the spread of communism especially, but never forget that Eisenhower was anti-fascist before he was anti-communist. We keep hammering in America on our anti-communist history. It's very true. But America also has a very strong anti-fascist history that has been largely erased, which I find fascinating because, of course, we did something to put down fascism. Oh, I know, we fought World War II. So he tries to stop the rise of both communism and fascism, and he does it some ways heavy-handedly and causes all kinds of trouble, like when he overturns the government in Iran. And he refuses to get involved in other places. He won't go into Vietnam because he says there's no way that that's a winnable war. But one of the things he tries to do is he tries to stabilize countries through the use of money, by going ahead and trying to improve their governments through the use of financing, because that's what America's got, is a lot of financing. Now, that's why we give money to other countries, is theoretically because originally it would stabilize these countries, but also because it cements friendly ties, right? That's not to say those things should not be re-examined. So one of the things on the table, of course, is that one of the reasons Europe was able to develop the advanced social systems it has is because America put so much of its money into armaments. So, a big part of our budget goes to protect other people. And that's one of the things that was behind the impulse behind Trump saying these people have to pay up. There was underneath that a kind of theory, although I'm not at all sure Trump understood what was there. But I think it's legitimate to wonder about these things and certainly to talk about them. There's also the issue of the fact that that's how Paul Manafort got his international start, was by basically working for dictators around the globe. I mean, his company became known as the torturers lobby, because they would come to Congress and convince Congress people that that they were standing against communism, and so America was pouring money into, these places that were horrible on civil rights, and the torturers lobby. So I'm not taking a stand on whether everything absolutely has to be in this bill. What I'm trying to do is to go ahead and give you a history of why America has traditionally, since World War II, spent its money fairly freely overseas, why there might be some reasons to actually examine different places we spend money, and some of the good things and some of the bad things about it. But it's not just some like, we're hurting here at home, we need to cut over there. It's part of a much larger look at what America should do and what the American government should do. And also part of the real issue that, when we talk about there not being enough money to do whatever we want to do, $2,000 checks for people, free college, new roads, whatever your particular thing is. Remember, we're one of the richest countries on earth. There's plenty of money to do whatever we want to do. But someone's got to pay for it. And this is all part of that big discussion. What do we want? What does it mean to be part of this society? And what kind of society do we want to have? Do you want to have a society where, the top 1% or even less than that basically are billionaires and can do whatever they want and make whatever laws they want? Does that work for you? Well, I suppose it could work for you if you either expect that you're going to be one of those people, or you are happy just picking up a paycheck. I don't know, because I'm not one of them. But what do you in a democracy want this country to look like? And that's all of these questions are part of that. Foreign aid, why? Which kind of foreign aid, to whom, who decides, and what part of our budget should that be? There's also the argument, I think, that was made so brilliantly by, I think it was by Fiona Hill in her testimony before Congress, and that's that, one of the things that the Trump administration does is they have really slashed the State Department. And that's a huge problem. I think if you're going to be engaged at all overseas, is the State Department, as she said, is really the first defense of the military. That is, you need the military when whatever the State Department is doing falls apart, but state is so important. And that's another place where we've cut dramatically. For my part, I would love to see the State Department built back up. They're the people who negotiate with foreign countries. All right, so I hope that was enough on money given to other countries. Another question here: has any where did it go? Oh, there it is. Has any administration in the past ever given so much trouble to an incoming administration? And that's a very good segue here. That was a good segue to this, because the answer to that is no. And a second answer to that is that there have been two other administrations that have certainly given this one a run for its money in terms of trying to cripple the next administration. And then there's finally the great dramatic bad transition of 1860. So let me work back from there. Herbert Hoover, who was a Republican, whom Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt beat in the 1932 election, tried desperately to cripple the incoming FDR administration because he believed that it would destroy America, because he recognized that FDR was going to go ahead and use the government in new ways. And honestly, FDR's language was really scary when he wrote in when he ran in 32, because he talked about declaring war on poverty, things like that, and the idea of the war powers used during peacetime scared me. It definitely would have scared me to think people have elected this guy to come in and do whatever he wants. How is that different than the dictators rising around the world? So Hoover decided he would do everything he could to try and hamstring FDR. But here's the big caveat: until we had the New Deal, the government didn't do all that much stuff. So it was much harder, for example, for Hoover to try and do what the Trump administration has done to the Biden administration. So, for example, we now know, as it was pretty clear and easy to suspect early on, that there really never was a plan for the coronavirus vaccine distribution. The Trump administration was planning simply to get the vaccine to states, to state capitals, and let the states handle it. But of course, the states don't have any money, so there needs to be very much a comprehensive plan. And of course, they wouldn't tell Biden about that, and now he's madly trying to get that up and running. We're way behind on vaccine distribution from what the Trump administration promised. Biden actually came out today and complained that the Trump administration is not sharing with him information about national security. That's so not okay, because that's our national security. And again, in 1932, there wasn't a lot to worry about in national security. And so there's a lot of that needs to be shared and is not being shared. There's also this whole thing with the cyber hack from Russia. Biden's not being briefed on it. So somebody asked, what could he do about that? He has the huge advantage of the fact he does have 50 years of ties in Washington. So he's got a very good team. They know what they're doing. And I suspect he knows probably more than the Trump administration would like for him to know, but it's still not okay what they're doing. The other administration that tried to cripple the incoming administration for the same reason was the Benjamin Harrison administration. Did everything it could to hamstring the Grover Cleveland's second administration for the same reason. They were afraid that the Cleveland administration would go ahead and lower the tariff, which big business really cared about a lot. So they deliberately crashed the economy in 1893. I'm sure you've heard of the Panic of 1893, which in every textbook gets thrown onto Grover Cleveland. Didn't happen on Grover Cleveland's watch. The economy crashed 10 days before he took office. And it did so pretty much because the outgoing president kept saying he's going to destroy the economy. He's a crazy radical. Take your money out of the stock market. If you have money in America, take it out. It's a time when there was a lot of foreign investment in the country. And they deliberately crashed the economy. And then in the midterm elections of 1894, they said, if you reelect Republicans, it's going to be fine. The Republicans get control of Congress again, and that's it. Money flows back into the country, and the Panic of 1893 is over. So that's a case where it worked fairly well. And then there is the transition of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860. James Buchanan, who's the outgoing Democratic president, says, "Man, I wish I could do something, but I guess I can't." And as you know, a number of southern states secede from the Union and create their own country, and in the process go ahead and seize a bunch of federal government territory, and which James Buchanan is like, no, they can't do it, but I can't stop them. So by the time Lincoln comes in, he's got a full-fledged crisis on his hands that Buchanan had left for him to deal with. So those are the other times this has happened. It's not okay, but it is what it is, and I think that Biden is curiously on top of this. It's just a funny thing, there are many ways in which I personally did not think that this was necessarily Biden's moment, but I'm so pleased to have somebody going in who knows where the bodies are buried, if you will, because like if you asked me to go in and figure out who to talk to about a cyber hack, I simply wouldn't have known the difference between the 14-year-old tech and the guy who'd been overseeing the entire construction. Biden will know who to talk to, and that's a very good thing right now. All right, a couple more things here. You guys are interested about the election, what's happening on the 6th. Nothing's happening on the 6th in terms of the counting of the electoral votes. What is happening on January 6th is this, and I've talked about this before. The Congress needs to go ahead and count the votes that came from the electors in each state, and they do it state by state. There are a number of states that Republicans have said they're going to challenge. It is not unusual to challenge a vote. Sometimes it's symbolic, or to challenge the ballots. In this case, there are going to be most likely, at least in some states, competing sets of ballots, maybe, or not. in the House of Representatives, so what happens is this: they get together, the House and the Senate get together in a joint session, and they open the ballots. And the person who opens the ballots is the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence. So he's going to theoretically open whatever's there. The chances are pretty good in this day and age. It's on a tablet or what, I don't know. But he basically says, Maine casts its ballots for whomever, right? So he's going to go ahead and do that. And for each state, Congress either accepts them or not. And it's pro forma, except that one could challenge them. So it's likely that there are numbers of people in the House of Representatives, Republicans, who are going to challenge those states that Trump has been yelling about. These are clear. They have been decided for Biden. The votes were counted for Biden. There have been recounts. The electoral delegates have gone ahead and filed their. I mean, at this point, everything's set except the sort of the accepting of the votes. So what will happen is if just a member of the House pitches a fit and nobody in the Senate does, nothing happens. The whole problem goes away. If a senator will come forward and say, "Oh, we're not okay with this," then you need somebody from the House and one person from the Senate to say, "No, we reject the votes from." I'm not going to pick on Maine again, from Alaska. They're not going to. Maine and Alaska are fine. So I'm just picking those at random. So then if two people, one from the House, one from the Senate, says, "No, we don't agree with this," then the two houses go back to their own chambers and they have 2 hours to debate whether or not they're going to go ahead and take these votes. In the House, it's a Democratic House, and then they decide by a simple majority. In the House, it's a Democratic House, so of course they're going to accept them. In the Senate, enough senators have already said they will not challenge these votes that it's not going to go anywhere. And now, so people are like, what's Pence going to do? What's Pence going to do? Pence in the Constitution presides over the reading, which means that he's supposed to make sure that everybody behaves, that nobody, I don't know, starts a fist fight or whatever. And he's supposed to read them. He doesn't have the ability to change anything or to have a deciding vote or anything else. So in terms of this being this last ditch moment for Trump to win the election, the representative from Illinois, Kitzinger, has said he's just raising money. This is just a way for him to keep that money flowing into his pockets because, as you know, he's raised a ton of money since the election on the idea that he's going to challenge the election. So there's that. There is also the fact that there's a bunch of things I think going on. One of them is how does he stop? I mean, at what point does the president kind of go, "Oh, oopsie poopsie, never mind"? He walked himself into this. You'll notice the Senate did not. The Senate gave itself an out. They said, we're going to be behind this until the Electoral College meets. Once the Electoral College meets, if it decides for Biden, okay, we're going to go with Biden. And so they had an off ramp. Members of the House and the president did not give themselves an off ramp, so it's hard to know where that off is going to be. So that being said, the other thing about January 6th is that Trump is working very hard to suggest there's going to be some huge rally and some huge violent uprising in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. And I think that's likely, actually, although today the hotel in Washington where the Proud Boys tend to congregate closed for 4th, 5th, and 6th. They said, we don't want any part of this. And some people are going to turn out. Who knows what's going to happen? I will point out here, though, as people are saying it's going to be horrible and all that. We said the same thing before the election. Many people said the same thing before the election. I really didn't say that before the election because I thought that kind of would create it. Remember that when I talked to you all the day of the election, I said, look what's not happening. There are not riots across this country. And we heard for weeks there were going to be. Maybe this will be the last gasp and there'll be some great, some large, great, meaning large, not good, riots. I'm an agnostic on that. But in terms of overturning the election, always think to yourself when you think something like this, what would that look like? What would it look like for Pence to say, if he had the power, which he doesn't, to say, I'm counting all these out and I'm counting them for Trump? What would that say to every court in the, remember, Trump has lost like 60-1 on court cases. What would it say to the fact that Biden has a majority? There's a lot of people who more people voted for Joe Biden than voted for Donald Trump. I mean, it's not really sustainable at this point to say, oh yeah, we're going to throw out everything that's happened that has been Biden, 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 and instead we're going to put in Trump. I don't see how you do that. I truly don't see how you do that. I mean, that's called a military coup in other countries, but our military has said we don't want any part of this. So, unless it's going to be Trump and Ivanka out there with slingshots, I don't really see how that's going to happen. So that's the 2006. I love Anne asked what are Pence's options, and when I read that, I thought his options are run, Michael, run, because I would not want to be where he is right now. Because you can see he's doing his best to stay as far away from Trump as he can, because Trump's putting tons of pressure on him, the same way he put pressure on the Georgia people and all that. They can't do anything except try and start a coup. And why would Pence do that? So and I have read, I don't have personal experience, I have read that Trump is horrible to people in his presence if he's mad at them. All right. I would love to talk. Jeff? I hope you will ask Jeff. I can't read it. Fuhita. I hope you will ask me again about term limits. So maybe I'll give you a quick thing on term limits. No. I will do term limits after the inauguration, if you guys still want me to do these, because I wanted to get to this. And that's the question of looking forward. How does one look forward after this period we've gone through, and how does the country rebuild itself? And you've certainly heard a lot about Trump's pardons. Somebody asked, can Trump really give a preemptive pardon to his children or anybody else? Yes, he can. Remember, that's what Ford did with Nixon, although it's not entirely unlimited, in the sense that it's only for federal crimes, and it's, you can't say, I hereby pardon you for anything you have ever done forever and ever, amen. I mean, he does have to build some limits around what that pardon, what that pardon looks like, or it'll be challenged. Tina Garvey asked, doesn't an impeached president lose any powers? No. A convicted president does, but remember, impeachment just says the House of Representatives thinks that you have committed high crimes and misdemeanors and doesn't trust you. If the Senate says to the House, you're nuts, he's fine, doesn't matter. Your slate is wiped clean again. And a person can be impeached more than once, too, which didn't happen this time around. All right, so so let me go back here to reconciliation and what reconciliation will look like, because you're certainly seeing all kinds of punditry nowadays about. I'm sorry, somebody just corrected me. Ryan Mickelson corrected me. He never lost a court case. The courts all dismissed the cases. That's correct. I was speaking loosely there about the fact he hasn't won anything there. All right, so. Reconciliation. And this I'm going to draw some ideas here from Reconstruction, because I've given a lot of thought about this. As you know, I'm a scholar of Reconstruction. And mind you, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about what happened in history, and I'm going to tell you about what historians who study these things think. And then I'm going to make some suggestions about the future. But as always, when I do these talks, I want you to know I'm really on firm ground in terms of the history. I often misspeak, by the way. At one point, I don't know, was it last week? I confused Stalin and Lenin. It's because I do it without notes. So if I misspeak, it's sure, call it out, but I'm not. That's an error. And I might talk more about that today too, which I intended to. But when I talk about what I think about the future, please remember I am one person, and I do have some ideas about it, but I am not the person who's going to define what the future looks like. The whole point of what I do is to say to you, this is a democracy. It's also a republic. And again, that's the whole difference between, I don't have a dog, I have a golden retriever. Republics and democracies are both forms of government in which the people have the say about their government. A republic is, we do it through elected representatives rather than through a direct democracy. And as I mentioned before, somebody did just ask, as I mentioned before, this became a popular trope by the John Birch Society, which didn't want black voting. So they said it's okay for African Americans, they didn't say that word, not to vote because we're a republic. They're represented by everybody else. Not the case. But in our system of government, the whole point of, I think, how we got here is that lots of ordinary people stopped showing up. And there are a lot of ordinary people who have really good ideas. And I really believe in the Enlightenment idea that if we crowdsource, if you will, a term they weren't using back in the Enlightenment, if we really all participate and bring new ideas to the table, we'll pick the right ones. Not always, we'll screw up, but to me, that is a far better system of government than when we simply turn everything over to the Mitch McConnells of the world. So I'm going to make suggestions, but please never think, well, I think this might be a good idea, but Richardson says something else, we should do that. That's not at all the case. This is about empowering you to have the tools for you to go forward and make decisions about your government from the local level right up to the national level. So here's where I am with going forward. And that is that how do we reconcile? The real mistake I think that people made after Watergate and after the Civil War was by believing that it was magnanimous to and that it would help heal to forgive everybody and simply to move forward. And that, to my mind, now that I'm older, I used to think that, but now that I'm older, I think that was a terrible error. I think that if you live in a country of laws, that everybody needs to be responsible to those laws, that everybody has to be treated before the bar of justice equally. So I'm not suggesting necessarily that Nixon should have been convicted. I don't know, because he was never held to trial, but he should have gone to trial. Or he should have, if he was indicted, he should have been indicted. And if he were indicted, he should go to trial. And that's what happened after Reconstruction or after the Civil War. Grant and Lincoln, of course, died, but Grant tried to be magnanimous and say, oh, it's okay, go home and be nice now. And what that does is it creates a space for the ideas that animated enemies to grow freely. To be able to do as people did after the Civil War, say, we were right all along. The only reason Grant let us off is because he knew we were the better team. He knew that he had only been bested because he knew that he had only bested us because he had all those nasty factories behind him. We're the ones who stood for America. We're the ones who did all the good stuff. And what that did, of course, was it managed to make sure that ideology of racism and of white supremacy and the idea that a few people should rule survive in America. Now, contrast that with what happened or what would have happened, and I'll get to what happened in Germany in a minute, what would have happened if there had been a penalty for being a Confederate, and if people had actually had to go before courts and they had to be tried. And a great example for what would have happened is what happened after we got the Department of Justice established under Grant in 1870, when they actually went and held trials for members of the KKK and, threw like 1,000 of them in jail. When that happened, the KKK went underground and it didn't rise again for 30 years or more. No, about that. Making people pay for committing crimes against other Americans and against our government is not bitterness. It is not retribution. It is not some sort of evil thing. It's consequences. And until we have consequences for bad behaviors, then bad people push the envelope farther and farther and farther. So I maintain, you've heard me say this before, if Nixon had been indicted and gone to trial, even if he had been found not guilty, we would never have had the Iran-Contra affair, because Reagan and Oliver North and John Poindexter would have recognized that they too could have gone to prison for long periods of time. And now after Trump is pardoning everybody that was involved with the Russian affair and all those other things, we're obviously going to have to rein in or at least examine the parameters of pardons, because the same thing happened with Iran-Contra. All those people got pardoned under the advice of William William Barr, when he was Attorney General under President Bush. So the pardon power obviously has now been begun to be used for pardoning basically crimes at the highest level, and that's not okay either. But so I'm a big believer in making people bear the consequences of their actions. Now, there's a really important distinction to be had here. And that important distinction is that does not mean I'm pissed off at you, so I'm going to take you out and line you up against the wall and shoot you. Because there's a great colleague of mine, and I hate to mention names without people's permission because sometimes it comes back to haunt them, but he studied the difference between East Germany and West Germany after World War II. And what he discovered was that democracy thrived in West Germany because they paid attention to the law. So everybody started to be, not started, but even former Nazis started to care a lot about legal processes, because if they didn't care about those legal processes, they were going to have what happened to other Nazis in East Germany. They got taken out and lined up against a wall and shot, whether or not it followed the legal process at all. And what he discovered in his work was that if you honored the political process, and the legal process, that people became committed to that legal process. And that, of course, is the realm in which democracy thrives, when we all are equal before the law. If you try and circumvent that, either by being monstrous and just simply shooting people, or by being too generous and saying, it's okay, just don't do it again, people are not committed to the democratic process. They are instead committed to making friends with the right people. And that's exactly when a democracy breaks down. So when I think about moving forward, I kind of cringe when people say, oh, we're going to go ahead and let anybody who committed crimes get away with it. Because I think, well, terrific. It's going to be worse next time. Now, there's something important to say about that, too. And this brings me to one of the first questions somebody asked. I don't think she's listening because she asked it through email. And that is, what about in all these investigations? So, like, here is Richardson saying we got to hold people to account. But what about Hunter Biden and Benghazi and all this kind of stuff? I want to be really clear here, and this is one of the reasons that I do these talks, and I want to end with where I hope they will go. The Republicans, and again, I want to emphasize that when I talk about Republicans in this broad brush, what I mean are the people who are currently in power. The Republican Party has a long, storied, and noble history. And I know a lot of people who still claim allegiance to that Republicanism. And I know it sucks to hear somebody like me going, oh, the Republicans, when you're one of those Republicans. A lot of my friends are those Republicans. When I say the Republicans, I mean the leadership. I mean Roger Stone. I mean Stephen Miller. I mean Donald Trump, Mike Pence, the people who are currently in power, because to my mind, they're not Republicans. I think they're radicals. I think they're trying to destroy American democracy. That's not the same as the old traditional Republicanism. But if you look at the Republican Party, they figured out in the 1990s that if you held investigations, the news media would cover it again and again and again, and people would start to hear about it, even if it wasn't true. They would start to hear about it and they'd think, oh, something's going on. So really dramatically in the 1990s, first of all, they held investigations of voter fraud. They never found any, but they convinced Americans it was out there. And then they also held one investigation after another of Bill Clinton, including, you probably have forgotten this because everybody now remembers Monica Lewinsky, but that actually started as soon as Clinton got into office with some invented scandal over the travel office. And then there was another scandal involving a young staffer whose name I'm not going to mention. His family's been through enough. Then there was another scandal about one thing after another. And they finally came up with Whitewater. If you remember, Whitewater, which again had been an organization in which the Clintons had invested, then they had lost their shirts. And then after they were no longer associated with it, then those people did something corrupt or whatever. These were manufactured to keep the idea in the news that the Clintons were somehow corrupt and evil. And this is a procedure that authoritarian governments, including Russia and the old governments in Ukraine, used to do. You constantly hold investigations because even if there's nothing there, people will think there are. Case in point, Hillary Clinton's emails. There was no there. Like all those investigations, and they were looking for everything. Finally, last October, and you had to look for it when it came out, the investigation ended, and there finally was a report. It's very difficult to find. I have found it. I've read it a couple of times because I kept reading about it in the media and thinking, that's not what I read. I must have been wrong. I'd go back and read it. They said, no, there's not a problem here. There was nothing that was deliberately mishandled. Yeah, people were sloppy, but people are always sloppy. And there was no there. But how many Americans today think she mishandled her emails? Similarly, Hunter Biden. Again, I got nothing on Hunter Biden one way or another. But did you notice what happened to all the Hunter Biden stories? They're gone because it was simply a ploy to try and convince everybody that Joe Biden was corrupt. And by the way, Hunter Biden might be corrupt. I have no idea. He's not in the government. At the same time, we've got Ivanka, Eric, and the other one in unelected people who are sort of acting like the crown family, and doing Ivanka getting her trademarks in China, and Kushner getting loans from, was it Yemen or wherever it was, when they, all that stuff going on. Hunter Biden is a private citizen, and that's another one of those great examples. And similarly, Benghazi. I mean, one of the things that people always forgot about Benghazi is that it was the Republicans who slashed the budgets for the protection of places like the Benghazi outpost, and there was other things going on with Benghazi as well. Again, terrible tragedy, 4 Americans lost. But what about now going forward into the Biden administration? I would like to know. I'm actually a big fan of investigations, a really big fan, because they tell us things that we need to know, and they produce reports for people like me and for historians. I would like to know what the heck happened with our approach to coronavirus. Why are our death rates off the charts compared to every other nation? I mean, was it deliberate? I feel like I need to know. I want to know for real what happened with this cyber attack. I mean, there are plenty of reasons that it's a good thing to do to investigate what's happened. But generally, when there's an investigation and somebody's actually guilty, the people scream witch hunt. Nixon did that about Watergate. Obviously, Trump has done that with Russia. And there's plenty there on Russia, by the way. I'm so sick of hearing there was no collusion. Collusion is just an adjective. There's no legal definition of it. And there's plenty about how involved the Trump campaign was with Russia in 2016. So my take on it is this, and I know I've run over here. My definition here is, or my future is this. I want people to bear the consequences of their actions. At all levels of society, by the way. That's not limited to our leadership. And I do believe in mercy, but I also believe that we have laws for a reason. So I believe people should be responsible. I also believe we need investigations. But here's where I come in, and here's where you come in. One of the things that I'm always trying to do is emphasize for you to look kind of below the news. If you hear a million stories about the Republicans investigating, well, you saw this with Hunter Biden, and now all of a sudden there's nothing there. What's really there? What actual evidence is there? And one of the ways that you can tell what kind of a story you're getting is this. Look at the language that news reporters use. So first of all, the news reporters, a real news source like CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, any place that's actually a newspaper. In order to be a reporter in a newspaper like that, you got to have 2 sources for anything you say. And then there's a third source, and this is that I'm not a journalist. I don't have sources. What I do have is documents. And when you see documents like laws, like congressional debates, like reports, like releases from the White House, like press releases, those you can read. I can read. Just Google them, and you can see what's in there. And that's how you tell if somebody is real. Now, obviously, the Fox News channel does not do that. They do have real reporters. Shep Smith was one of mine. I always pick on him, but Chris Wallace is another. But most of their people are opinion personalities, and you can see this as recently as this fall when somebody sued Sean Hannity, and a judge who'd actually been appointed by Donald Trump said, "Oh, nobody in their right minds would take Hannity as anything other than entertainment. It's not news, and therefore he can't be sued for misrepresenting the news, or for defamation is what he was being sued for. So a real news story will have sources, a couple of sources, and you can trust them, because if they make a mistake, they will withdraw it and they will explain and they will clean things up. But the other thing you want to do is look at the language that they use. So if they say, Donald Trump today said, I don't know, the Washington Monument is on fire. That's a really important thing to note, because he didn't say, the reporter did not say the Washington Monument is on fire. They said Trump said the Washington Monument is on fire. So there is a layer in which they are reporting the language. You know, Jim Jordan said this happened. And that's really important, because one of the things that the people currently in charge of the Republican Party have done is they have managed to take things like investigations, like the impeachment hearings, for example, and turn them into the news. So if you remember during that, people like Jim Jordan, people like Ratcliffe from Texas were going ahead and they would scream and they would throw accusations and they would badger people and they'd bully people. And that became the story. The story was not then the actual evidence that Fiona Hill and all the other people came up with. The story was this maelstrom they had created. And one of the things you're going to want to do in the Biden administration is actually watch what's happening. You know, are these debates and are these things that are showing up in the news actually based in fact, or are they reporting on what people said? And one of the things you'll see again and again in the news is news people tend to repeat what each other says. And so sometimes the news they'll lose some of those words and it will become a different story than was actually on the ground. And Hillary Clinton's emails are a great example of that. The report that exonerated her from wrongdoing in that got very little play, and the play that it did get sort of said, oh, they found all these things wrong. Well, they did find all those things wrong, but they said, these are on the fringe. The major story is there's nothing here, but that major story really got lost in that it was in a long report, and you had to read it pretty carefully, and journalists are doing a lot of different things. So going forward, I hope that people will be responsible before the law, but I would urge you to recognize that there will be investigations, and some will be actual attempts to get at the truth. And many of them will, in fact, simply be an attempt to probably undermine the Biden administration. I expect if the Republicans stay in control of the Senate, we're going to see one Senate investigation after another that is simply going to head and try and muddy the waters to try and hurt the Biden administration. I will say, if you look at the things that have come out about the special committee on the coronavirus in the House or on something like that, the material that they have turned up already is just the emails, about let's get people sick, let's infect people. There's a lot there, and that's the sort of thing. When they can say, here are the emails, here are the documents, that's what you look for. You don't look for, here's what people said, because remember, unless people are under oath, there's no guarantee they're telling the truth. So that's what I want. What would be a really good thing to look forward to look for as we go forward. All right, I did go over. But finally, I just want to say thanks for a great message. But we're at the end of 2020, and I feel like we all know the American government more than we did a year ago. And I'm going to leave you on one positive note. And by the way, I'm already working on my last thing for the year, my last writing for the year. It's that the people say to me, how can I be so sanguine and cheery about the future? I'm not naive. Our work begins on January 20th. And I don't mean that in a partisan way. I don't mean that for Democrats versus Republicans. I mean that for Americans. We are in this moment in American history when our government does not match our people. And we need to figure out how to make that match happen. And one of the things that gives me hope is how many people who were not previously involved in our democracy are stepping up to the plate and saying, hey, I care about this issue. I'm going to call my Congress critter, or I care about this issue. I'm going to get out there and work for it. Or even I care, as somebody said to me today, I care about this issue, and I'm not going to listen to anybody any longer who says something along these lines. And I know that was cryptic, but I think it works for a lot of different things. Taking up oxygen and talking about what makes this country great is something I think that those of us who care deeply about democracy and equality before the law and equality of opportunity have not been as good as we need to be about for the last 40 years. And now's our time. So I'm pleased to be on this journey with you all, and I'll try not to go over next time. I hope everybody has a good end of the year, and boy, let's cross our fingers and work hard to make 2021 a great one. Thanks a lot.